I'm Scott Schiff, along with William Swig, and this is the Ayn Rand Fan Club. Thank you for joining us today. We are very pleased and honored to have as our guest today philosopher Stephen Hicks, the senior scholar at the Atlas Society and professor of philosophy at Rockford University. His book, Explaining Postmodernism, really, to me, makes him the man who wrote the book on postmodernism. Stephen, thank you so much for joining us today.
Well, thanks for the invitation, guys. I appreciate it much.
Absolutely. Before we jump into postmodernism, CRT, can you just give us a little bit of a background, how you got into Rand in relation to becoming a professor?
Well, those are initially not connected at all.
Okay.
I was, as a young person, I did sports and chased girls and so on, but I like to read books a lot. And my parents also were big readers. And most summers I would work my way through their bookshelves. They had a nice collection of books. I remember coming across a big hardbound copy of Atlas Shrugged when I was about 13 and asking my mom about it. And she said, that's a really good book, but maybe put it aside for a few years and, when you're a little bit older. So the name stuck with me. And then I graduated high school and I was going on a trip to Europe. I'd saved my money and we're at Toronto Airport. My dad took me into the bookstore after finding out I didn't have a book for the plane. So just perusing through there, I found a copy of the Fountainhead on the shelves. Remembered the name, so I took that with me to Europe and read it several times over the course of that trip. It was immediately engrossing to me. So both my parents played a role in getting me to the Rand volumes. So at that point, when I came back from Europe, I started university, and I'd been thrilled by the Fountainhead, so started reading Atlas, and then through all of the nonfiction and the rest of the fiction. But at that point, I was not at all serious about becoming a philosopher. I didn't even know what philosophy was until I went to university. At that point, I was actually planning to be a civil engineer and an architect, and then to go into business with my dad. So it wasn't until 5 or 6 years later that I got serious about philosophy and decided to go to grad school and become a professor.
Okay, that's great. It just, everyone is talking about postmodernism and the threat, and rightly so, but I just think you identified its pernicious nature so much earlier than most people. And I don't think enough people in the liberty movement appreciate that. General MacArthur is famous for having said, basically, all failures in war can be summed up as not in time or too late. And I think that applies to intellectual movements as well. And I think because you saw the threat so much earlier that, I've even seen Jordan Peterson interview you, himself quite early on, identifying the threat of postmodernism. And even he sees you as a reference for his audience, like when he wants to do a deeper dive into postmodernism.
Yeah.
As for me, I think I remember around the early 90s, hearing about political correctness in school. Just some, as you were, realizing the philosophical underpinnings of it, anecdotally, what were you seeing in academia?
Yeah. Well, in a way, the point you're making is a testament to the power of ideas as I see it. So one of the things that philosophy does for those who get into it is that it enlarges your sense of what the issues are. And the more you integrate that with history, you can see how philosophical ideas have played out. I just love that quotation from Lord Bolingbroke that history is philosophy teaching by example. Philosophy is the theory, history is the practice. So particularly as we've gotten into the modern world, where the power of the human mind has really taken off and shaped culture in so many dimensions, religiously, politically, economically, scientifically, technologically, and so on, we are much more thinking big picture and thinking strategically. So my philosophical education and combined with my historical education, I think did put me in a good position to say, all right, here we are. I was in the 1990s. I'd finished my PhD work. I was a young professor. And I started reading more broadly in a lot of continental philosophy, which, frankly, my undergraduate education and graduate school education had been deficient in. I had a good history of philosophy of education, but much of it was from a more analytical and positivistic perspective. So many of the continental philosophers and thinkers were just names to me. So when I started reading seriously in the 1990s, I came across them, and a lot of it is crap, but at the same time, there was a lot of important stuff in the crap, and I could see that it wasn't just a few weird philosophers here and there, that the ideas were also getting into literature departments, getting into even nursing programs, getting into some of the schools of education, legal studies, and so on. So it struck me that here was a set of philosophical ideas, broadly called postmodernism. And to my way of thinking, it is important that Richard Rorty is a philosophy PhD, so is Michel Foucault and Derrida and Lyotard.
Heard those names.
And the power of their philosophical ideas was being taken up by the philosophically minded in other branches of academia. And they were starting to reshape curricula, we're starting to train a new generation of graduate students. So at that point, it was becoming clearer to me, and this has to be put in as a conditional. If these ideas continue down this path, this is where they are going to go. And that is, to a large extent, where we got to by the 2010s and on into the 20-teens. And then as it started to spill out, not only from the academic world, but into the broader culture, suddenly, right, everybody is hearing about postmodernism, as you point out.
Right. That's all right. I appreciate that insight. I brought up, I watched this interview with you and others at the Atlas Society right after January 6th. And I mean, even beyond that issue, it was just so chock full of important points that I wanted to ask you to elaborate on some of the ideas. It's titled An Objectivist Conversation on Recent Events. I'm going to link to it in the description. I figure, we talk
this
about these
the one
issues
with David Kelly or Richard Salzman and me.
That's right. That's right. And
okay, good.
Actually, first, I want to thank you and the others on that video. First, as an aside, for just not comparing January 6th to like 9/11, as some in the Liberty Movement did. I think some are too quick to accept the mainstream media's narrative of such events. But you referred to postmodernism as a subversion of every liberal civilizational norm, which to me was a crucial yet pithy description. I mean, you talked about it being in its second and third generation, which is why it's in the broader culture now. For years, I would hear people say, almost as a wish, that it hadn't gotten into the hard sciences. But I mean, isn't it really a matter of degree? And we're even seeing some examples where it is starting to get into the hard sciences, even into the boardrooms.
Yeah, so that's an interesting set of questions all in there. Yeah, there are generational effects. So from high theory, and postmodernism is as a set of ideas does operate at a high level of abstraction, and that gets worked out by philosophers in the 60s and on into the 1970s. Then it starts to get applied systematically in the major academic disciplines in the 80s, 90s, and then into the first decade of the 2000s. And then at that point, it's trained a whole generation of people who are not going to go on to become intellectuals, but who are going to become cultural workers in various sorts. And so it starts to spill out into the broader culture. And yes, I think the core of it is a subversion. And when you read the philosophers and the intellectuals, they will be very explicit that they know what the Enlightenment is. They know what the modern world is. And then more broadly speaking, they know what the entirety of Western civilization stands for, going back to the Judeo-Christian tradition and the Greco-Roman tradition. And they will say quite explicitly, and this is Heidegger and Heidegger's followers like Foucault and Lyotard and the others to say that is what we are against, right? So it's not, this or that concern about too much racism in hiring, right, or too much sexism and glass ceilings and so forth. All of that low-grade stuff is not what they are about. They are about undermining the entirety of the Enlightenment project, and then even more broadly, undermining the entirety of Western civilization. So it is self-consciously a subversion. At the same time, they are, of course, very successful at putting together coalitions. And coalitions have people who join them for a variety of levels of understandings and a variety of different motivations. And in many cases, people who think that they are attracted to postmodernism are really just attracted to one or two themes of it. They like the edginess of it, right? Or they think sometimes the claims of reason are oversold, or that some capitalists have behaved badly, so they're anti-capitalist and concerned about cronyism. And so all kinds of people who have more limited grievances can be attracted to some elements of postmodernism, and so they will join the coalition as well. And then another thing that I've been thinking a lot recently is, particularly as we see postmodernism as a cultural movement now, is the large number of people who are attracted to it, not, as far as I can tell, for intellectual reasons. They might be able to mouth, social justice warrior slogans, or talk about political correctness and use terms like structural racism and so on and throw them around. But for them, it seems to be much more of a psychological phenomenon. A large number of people who are resentful, filled with envy to a large extent. They feel that they are life's losers. And what this is an opportunity for them to have a kind of rationalization to go out and wreck stuff and get inside other people's heads and cause some psychological damage. So one fascinating thing, and I'm still thinking about this though, is if you look at what's going on culturally, some of it is top-down postmodern theorizing. Some of it is the strategic putting together of coalitions of people who have different levels of understandings and different agendas. But they have some common overlap enemies in what they see as Western capitalism or the Enlightenment. But a significant number of it, I think, is just psychologically disturbed individuals who just find postmodernism and its offshoots to be useful rationalizations for their personal issues. So I think when we start thinking about counter strategies and how to deal with these people, we do need to have a better demographic understanding of who is involved in the movements, and then have different kinds of responses depending on whether the person is a philosophical strategist, whether they're an activist coalition builder, or if they are just a psychologically disturbed individual.
If I could jump in right here.
Go ahead.
Hi, Stephen. This is William.
Hey, William.
I wanted to thank you also for coming on. And I'm a latecomer to your body of work, but I did spend the last couple of days reading your book, Explaining Postmodernism.
Well, thank you.
I really enjoyed it. I listened to you on the audiobook version and while I read along in the book. So it was quite enjoyable and I got pretty familiar with your voice.
All right.
You wrote the book in 2004, and I was wondering, when did you first come to a sort of realization that postmodernism was this great evil ideology? Because I was first introduced to it actually through ARI, and I was attending a lecture by Gary Hull in 97 or 96, I think. And he was talking about postmodernism and multiculturalism and how it was anti-Western culture and all of that. And that really impressed me in the 90s. So I'm wondering, like, when did you come to this realization?
Yeah, well, let me backtrack. Yeah, the book was published, or the first edition was published in 2004. But I actually wrote it during 1999, 2000, first half of 2000. I was on sabbatical from my university. And I had a fellowship half paid for by my university and half paid for by Atlas Society. So I was in residence in New York, where their offices were at the time. But while I got the book done in 2000, I had some troubles getting it published. That's another story. Your question, though, is about when I came to the realization of it. I would say I finished my PhD work in 1991. I started teaching at Rockford University in 92. And they had a very robust honors program teaching our best students. And one of the interesting things about it was that it was interdisciplinary, and each of the courses was taught by two professors, and they always were from different disciplines. So I would be then invited to team teach a course with a history professor or a literature professor or an anthropologist. And it was at that point, I was a little tired of what I'd been working on in my dissertation. I knew I needed to farm that out into some articles and so on, but I wanted to do some other stuff. So I just started reading around in the literature, but then also partly due to my colleagues at my university, I was exposed to some postmodern thinkers whom I hadn't heard of. And those were the ones who led me then back to Foucault and Derrida and Rorty and so on. I actually was already quite familiar with Rorty's work. So I would say then from about 92 until 96, I was doing a lot of reading, and then coming to say that, you know, there's a lot of philosophical sophistication here, all of the epistemological arguments, all of the theories about human nature, all of the value orientations and the understanding of ethics and morality from their perspective as being highly socially constructed and group relative, the strong themes of metaphysical anti-realism, and then of course the political overlay, the kind of the relentless critique of Western liberalism and capitalism and the whole Enlightenment project. So it struck me probably by the time of the middle 90s that this was a comprehensive philosophical package that was put together and was then starting to be mobilized. So I would put it right then. The other thing I remember is around 1996 or 1997, I had a promising group of philosophy majors, and their capstone course is a course we call the senior seminar. And so I remember running through, deciding to focus that on postmodernism. And so working with a group of very bright undergraduates, and we read a lot of the major postmodern thinkers, and I started trying out some of my ideas about how it all fit together. Then the next thing that happened for me was in 1998. I think the Atlas Society had a conference in Colorado, and they invited me out, and I gave two hours of lectures on postmodernism, and that really was my first run through of the whole package, putting it all together. And then on the basis of that, then in 1999, they invited me during my sabbatical year to come, and that's when I wrote the book. So it was a development over the course of the 1990s then to answer your question, William.
Sure.
That's great. A follow-up, getting back to the subversion issue in postmodernism, I was curious, do you think that subversion was a driving force initially with the postmodernists, or did it kind of develop over time? Were they initially totally against these civilizational norms, or were they?
Yeah, I think it comes from two directions. One, it comes from a more political direction. If you have prior political commitments that lead you to think that the current society you are in is basically evil, wrong, destructive, bad, alienating, oppressive, the whole vocabulary, then you will set yourself up as an enemy of the current system, and you will want to subvert it. And so to the extent that the postmoderns, and certainly in the first two generations of postmodern, it's almost exclusively a far left-wing political phenomenon, and that's well worked over territory. For the last century and a half, far left-wing activists and intellectuals see themselves as trying to destroy, subvert, mount a revolution that will entirely destroy and supplant Western capitalism, liberalism, the Enlightenment project, and so on. So the subversion language, I think, does fit for those who come to the postmodernism primarily through a political route. Now, I don't want to generalize it totally and say it's all about subversion, because there is another route to postmodernism. I think many people start more doing basic philosophy. They are interested in epistemological issues. They're interested in language and cognitive science and metaphysical issues and issues of human nature. And so what they will then do is be reading in the history of philosophy. So they will read their Descartes and Hume and Kant and Nietzsche and so on. And what they will then be struck by is the idea that reason is ultimately impotent, right? And or that reason is itself a socially constructed faculty, or that it is in some sense a kind of a Johnny-come-lately part of our biological package that just overlays as a very thin veneer what is an underlying seething bundle of evolutionarily programmed instincts. So what you then have is a highly philosophically informed person who doesn't think that we can know reality, that all of the old religious myths are just that. They're just a bunch of myths. But equally, from their perspective, science is a big bag of pretensions, because it's based on ultimately on reason, but from their perspective, reason has been exploded. And so if you find someone, and I think there are quite a number of postmodernists who follow this route, who start off buying into increasingly all of these skeptical arguments, that will lead them to a highly subjectivistic place. And on the basis of that subjectivistic position, they will end up saying, well, I have to deploy all of these skeptical arguments against all of the pretenses of reason. And it's not that they start out wanting to subvert anything, but they have, through the power of their reason, just come to anti-reason conclusions. And on the basis of that, they are just skeptics. Now, it then becomes kind of a personal commitment issue. Do you think, okay, I'm committed to skepticism. I don't think anybody knows anything, so I might as well then just kind of give up and retreat from anything and basically shut up and go away? Or does your personal psychology lead you to say, I want to be activist in puncturing what I see as the pretensions of reason, and so I will become an activist skeptic? And so there you will have a kind of subversion project, but it's more precisely targeted against epistemological targets.
It's kind of like the difference between an intellectual and a political postmodernist, right?
Yes, right. And so you can become a skeptic on epistemology and end up, I don't know, maybe as a kind of existentialist, right? There is no God to tell us what's to do. And the scientists are just working in their artificial laboratories with their abstract theories, and they're not really going to be out in a position to tell me what the meaning of life is. And so nobody really knows what's going on, and I'm just alone in the universe. So what I might as well do is just, introspect and find what passions in me happen to be strongly, and make a subjective commitment to those passions. And those passions might take me in a left-wing political direction, or it might take me in some religious direction, but then it just becomes a matter of personal idiosyncrasy at that point.
Good. Stephen, just getting back to that video on the recent events from Atlas Society, one of the great things you talk about is that even for decent, well-meaning people, it's hard not to get sucked into a revenge cycle. And you've also said it's difficult to get the response correct in an adversarial context. So I'm curious if you think the liberty movement has been too tough or not tough enough against postmodernists so far.
Yeah, here's another interesting blending of philosophy and psychology. The revenge cycle issue is a difficult one. I mean, it's one thing that is difficult in moral judgment of oneself and other people to do justice to people before pronouncing justice on them, and then making sure that one's response to them is proportionate to the transgression, if indeed there is a transgression. But it also is the case that psychologically, the way many of our emotions work is that we reach a threshold. And once that threshold is reached, we can get triggered. So there is a legitimate use of emotional triggering. Our positive passions and infatuations and love responses get triggered, and we get kind of overwhelmed with strong positive emotions toward someone, but also our negative emotions, anger, can get triggered and so forth, and we become kind of overly angry with people. And so we need to give ourselves time to cool down and so on. So the idea here then is once one gets triggered, one can easily overreact, but of course that's then going to cause the other person to get angry at what they perceive to be an injustice, and for that person to overreact, and then you have a downward vicious cycle. And it takes a very strong-minded person to be able to recognize that they are on that cycle, and then a strong-willed person to be able to step outside of that cycle, to give themselves the cooling down point, to be willing to forgive the person for overreacting in response to your overreacting, and to say, let's just set this aside and go back. And I'm sure that we're all familiar with this from family relationships, from friendships. You've got two people who are now 30 years old, and they hate each other. But why do they hate each other? And if you were to go back, it really is, really just something that happened in the schoolyard when they were both 6 years old. One of them did something a little bit stupid or silly. The other person overreacted. And then they just got onto a vicious cycle, and they couldn't step off it. So lots of individuals in their personal relationships, lots of social movements, lots of religious movements and intellectual movements get themselves stuck on this path dependence revenge cycle. So go ahead.
I was just going to say, on the other side where I was going, I think there's kind of a small L libertarian cheek turning that almost hopes to prove to these postmodernist moralizers that they aren't the racists, that they're accused of being. And to me, that's almost, what this Rand talked about being the sanction consists of today.
Right. Yes. So when you legitimately just let something go, even if it is an injustice, say, I'm not going to respond to this, I'm not going to bother with it. Or if you are going to respond to it in a measured fashion that doesn't go in the direction of overreacting, but then at the same time not underreacting. And it's the underreacting side that can set oneself up for the sanction of the victim problem, that to use Rand's language here. Now, all of that by way of coming back to the issue of libertarians in particular. No, I don't think libertarians are any different than any other movement. All religious movements deal with this, all families deal with this, all political movements deal with this. So, libertarians and libertarian-friendly people and objectivists, we are humans, and we all have the same psychology. The only thing I would say is that to the extent that you have a pro-reason psychology, philosophy, as objectivism has, that it should put you in a better position to learn to deal with these problems and react appropriately. And I would say the same thing for libertarianism. Someone who is attracted to libertarianism is going to be more likely to learn about principles of live and let live and tolerance and always seeking the win-win in social relationships and so on. But it's not going to make them immune to those problems. And the intellectual problems, as well as the psychological problems, libertarians are going to have to sort them out as well. Now, at the same time, I do think there is, your libertarianism is still, while a small organized movement culturally, it is a larger movement intellectually. But even there, as you know, it's a pretty big tent. And people do come to libertarianism from some different paths. So objectivists, for example, are typically impressed with the power of human reason. And we like to celebrate the major accomplishments of scientists and technologists and entrepreneurs. And we tend to valorize what reason can do for you in your individual life,
right,
and so on. But there are lots of libertarians who come to libertarianism from a very different philosophical perspective with respect to the power of reason. What they see is human life is very complicated, and any given individual knows a certain amount, but can easily make a lot of mistakes. And it's a lot of trial and error with an emphasis on error. And from their perspective, a lot of social correcting that goes on, and that the individual by himself or herself really is relatively powerless. And one of the great defenses of liberty for them is precisely to limit people's thinking that they know too much, because from their perspective and their reading of history, it's precisely the people who think that they're really smart and have all of the answers that are more likely to think they therefore have the or the political right to start telling other people what to do and to start using political power,
what not to do,
force people to do what they write. So what you then have is, within libertarianism, is two people coming from very different epistemological standpoints. And this latter group, I think, is going to then buy into skeptical arguments more, and that's going to make them more amenable to the kinds of more robust skeptical arguments that postmoderns offer, rather.
You also talk about how...
So let me just say, for example, I had a debate a couple of summers ago now with Thaddeus Russell, who is a good historian, tells good historical stories. But when he turns to libertarian philosophy, he integrates that with some fairly skeptical epistemological issues, precisely because he's worried that people who think reason is powerful, that science is powerful, are going to turn that into some sort of authoritarian imposition and take away people's freedoms. And that is the thing that leads him in a very postmodern friendly direction.
If I could jump in. Related to the revenge cycle issue is proportional responses.
Yes.
You mentioned the proportional responses, and I was wondering if you think that sometimes they perpetuate the revenge cycle, because sometimes I believe you need to use a disproportionate response or overwhelming response to basically end the dispute or conflict. Someone has to overpower the other person. And
yes.
Ideally, you want that to be the person who's the most rational, reasonable person. But
yes.
That doesn't always happen. So how do you deal with that problem of proportional responses perpetuating the cycle?
No, you're exactly right. And this is why philosophy, as a set of abstract principles about justice, right and wrong, and what the general normative principles should be, very important. But then there is a whole art to applying that to concrete situations. So, to put this in abstract objectivist kind of formulation, one thing that reason does is, when we're forming concepts and then generalizing to principles, is we abstract from particulars and we take the measurements out, so to speak, the measurement omission idea. But then when we are judging individuals and particular situations, we do have to put those measurements back in. And that's a very difficult cognitive process as well. Now, all of that is just to state the problem abstractly. So when is it appropriate to say, okay, so here, just to take the case of an injustice, when is it appropriate to say accurately, an injustice has been done to me, but I'm just going to let it go and blow it off and not even respond? When is it appropriate for me to say an injustice has been done to me and I should respond, and I should respond in a directly proportionate fashion, that the punishment should fit the crime. And just as in legal scholarship and in legal application in court cases, judges are very carefully trying to measure the degree of injustice and make sure that the punishment, the financial fine or whatever it is, or the amount of time in prison is directly proportionate to that. And then, as you are suggesting, when is it the case that an injustice has been done, and really what you need to do is respond completely disproportionately and overwhelm the person who has committed the injustice so that they are not even in a position to do an injustice to you again in the future. And I don't think there is any sort of formula or any sort of cookie cutter answer that we can do philosophically. What we have to do is look at examples and have general categories of response. And what I would say is the main spectrum here is the physicality of the issue. Are we talking about someone insulting you in a Facebook or social media forum, which is not very physical at all? Or are we talking about people pointing guns at you or pointing weapons in a warlike situation at you? So the more it is a merely verbal or merely intellectual issue, the more likely you should be to blow it off. The more physical it is and the more high stakes the physicality of it, the more a disproportionate response is called for. So what I would then say is, someone who's clearly a troll or an idiot says something that's wildly false and insulting about you online, just blow that off. Don't feed the trolls, don't respond, right, and so on. On the other hand, if you are in a military situation and some clear aggressor is pointing their weapons at you, you have every right to do a preemptive first strike and entirely destroy their military capacity so that they can't do you any damage. Now, where along that huge spectrum one is in a particular situation, lots of nuanced judgment is called for.
I mean, sometimes they do these just constant low-level attacks like cancel culture, or, some lefties will pretty much tell you openly their goal, even with the riots this summer, was to hope to get an overreaction to then use that to push a political agenda. And they say they're doing that to us, that they want us, we have no place in their future because we're an oppressor, gender, race, and so, they're almost telling us what their end game is and hoping that we overreact so they can target us first. And that there's no guide.
So the cancel culture examples, so I would want to drill down just a little bit. So are we talking about, say, on a university campus? And this is where the cancel culture label comes from. So you have an invited guest speaker, and they'll use kind of any tactic to try to get that person disinvited, or they will show up and try to shout the person down, or they'll start to do some level of physical intimidation. So are we talking about that kind of a context, or are you talking about people on the streets who are gathering in large numbers and intimidating other protesters or counter protesters, or engaging in property damage and trying to stimulate responses in that context? I think already we would need to drill down a little.
Sure, that's fair. I mean, in all, that seems to be basically the same tactics, to just do these low level, telling the other person you don't think they have a right to exist, and hoping they overreact.
Yes.
And so, but yeah, mainly just, it's what leads to the revenge cycle. It's that we're, we're frustrated because they're forcing us to self-censor. They're pretty much laughing about it. And, we're not allowed to say anything about it.
Yeah. Well, we are allowed to say things about it, and
Right.
so let me start with the university context. Yeah, I think there, is a significant number of administrators who are kind of spineless with respect to this issue. A certain number of them who are kind of bending over backwards with respect to these are just students and so on. So they're kind of just saying kids are being kids. And a certain number of them who are sympathetic to the cancel cultures or the social justice warriors as well. So in all three cases, there's a general pattern of an abdication of their responsibility to make sure that the university is a place where people are free to research and argue and discuss. But already you have three different kinds of administrators who are failing to do their jobs for three different reasons. So what I would say in that case is we just need to have administrators do their job. I mean, everybody knows what civil discourse should be at a university, how classrooms should be conducted, how people should behave in the case of an invited guest speaker, and so forth. So if in the case of an individual professor, if there is a cancel culture kind of person or a social justice warrior who's in your class, who's disrupting the educational process, it is the job of the professor to kick that student out of class. Give them person some warnings, explain to them what they're supposed to be doing in the class, and if they persist, then say, sorry, I'm dropping you from the course. They have the power to do that, and they have the moral obligation to do so. If the student refuses to leave physically, well, every university has security officers, and it is precisely the job of their security officers not to let individuals like that subvert the educational process. It's an injustice to the professor and all of the other students in the class. And the same thing should happen at say guest speaker level. You have someone who has been invited to the campus to give a talk. There's a room for questions and answers, a certain amount of heckling, that's fine. But again, a judgment call once things get to the point where the speaker is not able to speak, where other students and faculty in the audience are being intimidated. At that point, that's exactly what the security officers are there. Give the person a warning, and if they persist in disrupting the procedure, then those people should be removed physically. That's not rocket science, and we should be able to have enough backbone to be able to make sure universities are doing what they are doing. So that's how I would solve it at the university level. But I've been talking for a minute or two now. Let me kick it back to you to see what direction you want to go.
I want to try to take it from the personal, individual level. You were talking about campus students and causing problems, but I want to ask, what if it's a group, like a leftist group like Black Lives Matter or Antifa or something like that, and they're causing a cultural problem, societal problem?
Yes.
At what point of that revenge cycle does someone do, like maybe the more reasonable, liberty-minded people, do we need to step up and just crush them? How, like, at what point do you need to just stop them completely and take them out as a group?
Yeah. All right. So you mentioned Black Lives Matter and Antifa. And so my response to that would be to say we need to divide those two broad labels into three subgroups. So I think Black Lives Matter is actually two very different groups under one umbrella. The broad majority of people who are attracted to and even participating in Black Lives Matter are people for whom the issue of police brutality and double standards and lingering amounts of racism in society are a problem. And what Black Lives Matter means to them is that we don't yet have equal respect and equal administration of justice with respect to that group, whether their understanding of the demographics and the crime statistics and the levels of racism is accurate or not. I think these are mostly decent people who believe that we should have equal rights in the society, that we have fallen short, and so they are supportive of this particular group whom they believe genuinely are on the receiving end of certain numbers of injustices. So that's one kind of Black Lives Matter subgroup. Now, I think the leadership of Black Lives Matters is a different group. They are effective organizers, they are effective marketers, obviously, but they are much more adversarial. And I think ideologically, they are not interested in equal rights. What they are interested, I think, in is using racism as a bludgeon against what they take to be a fully flawed society that they want to take down and replace with some other kind of society. But that leadership is organizing a group, and as far as I can tell, they are using arguments, they are using marketing strategies, and they are raising funds, and they are, for the most part, not stepping over the line into outright violence. And so that group needs to be opposed intellectually. I think their strategy needs to be exposed and argued against, and better marketing strategies developed by people who are opposed to that, and better fundraising techniques need to be deployed, and so on. Now, to the extent that some Black Lives Matters activists have stepped over the line into physical violence, then fine, go ahead and arrest them and prosecute them and so forth. Antifa, I think, is a different group. I think they are quite obviously engaging in physical intimidation of people, threats, physical violence against some individual. That philosophy professor a couple of years ago who took a bicycle chain and hit somebody in the face with it, as a very clear example. Those who are destroying property, those are spilling out into physical violence. There, it's not just a matter of saying, here's their ideology, here's their marketing strategy. To the extent that they are rioting and physically intimidating people, well, we have laws on the books against property damage that are good laws, against physical intimidation and harassment that are good laws. Those should be enforced.
It's good. It does tie in with one other, my favorite part of the tape, where you say that, or the interview where you say there's a huge number of people who are decent and principled for the most part, but the way they operationalize their principles is in a conditional acceptance. And basically, I'll be a civilized person and commit to being civilized as long as you also are committing to being a civilized person.
Yes.
And, but if they're not being principled, then at that point, our principles go out the window and you become operating on an all's fair, love, and war. I mean, this was similar to my experience of reading Rand and saying, I've thought this, but hadn't fully put it into a principle yet. I mean, I've come to adopt kind of a golden rule: treat others as you want to be treated. But I've seen some objectivists dismiss that as being either second-handed or duty-based. I see it as treating them by the standard they set. I'm just curious where you are on that.
Yes, I do think, the most important thing is your personal commitment to being the kind of person that you want to be. And part of that includes identifying principles of personal morality and principles of social morality that you think are correct, and making those habitual in your life. Then a certain amount of that then is in the social morality part. How in general do I think of other people, and with our understanding of human nature, that you need to respect other people's rights at a minimum. But rights are kind of negative, to not, in a sense, kill them, not steal their property, not try to make slaves of them, right, and so on. But there is a space in personal social morality for being the person who initiates the goodwill gesture. So when two strangers meet, for example, to be the first person to say, hi, how are you, in a civil tone of voice, to put the hand out to offer a handshake, and just to signify that you want peaceful cooperative dealings with people, and then to have a more generalized set toward other people of, I'm going to see you as a potential friend, as a potential ally, as a potential business partner, and to be the person who takes the first step in that direction. And that is not yet conditional. Where the conditionality, I think, does come in appropriate is how that person responds to you. And if the person reciprocates, and I think most people will reciprocate, then you are in a virtuous cycle, or you start to build the social relationship in a positive direction. If the person's initial response to your goodwill gesture is negative, then I think at that point, you are perfectly justified in starting to scale back your goodwill gestures and to start to go in a direction of saying, okay, I need to be neutral with respect to this person, maybe go away from this person. But then if the person's response starts to scale up and become increasingly negative, then your self-response or self-defense response should be triggered in at that point. And then on a proportionate factor, do what you need to do in order to make sure you defend yourself.
I think this whole idea of treating each other the way you want to be treated ties into the very pernicious aspect of postmodernism, which you talked about in your book, called Weaponized Rhetoric. I think
yes,
one of the most vicious parts of postmodernism is the core attack on language. It's and that goes to just the civility we have when we're talking to each other. Like, we don't name call each other. We don't use ad hominems. We try to steel man arguments. We don't straw man. But you identified these things such as straw manning and ad hominem as essential to postmodern rhetoric. And that's kind of like just an attack on civil language, just at the root. And it destroys our ability to just talk to each other in a civil way.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes. So thanks for highlighting that part of the book, because I do think it's quite fundamental. Now, this is an issue that goes back to some epistemological issues, some issues about human nature, about the foundations of ethics, and then how that plays out in social and political theory. So if you start from the position as we start, that language is a tool of reason, and the first thing that we're trying to do with our minds, using our reason, is figure out the way the world works, so we know how to act in the world in order to live successful lives. Then language becomes absolutely important, and clarity of language, forming concepts precisely, defining terms accurately, building up classification structures and taxonomical schemes and cause and effect understandings formulated in propositional principles and so on. All of that becomes absolutely important to each of us as individuals. To the extent that we then use language as a communication tool socially, we're sharing information with each other because we are friends, we're romantic partners, we're business partners, right, and so on. Language becomes an absolutely essential communication tool, but for it to work well, again, terms need to be clear, properly defined, right, et cetera, so that we can get the social benefits of language as well. So what the postmoderns are doing then with the phrase, as you pointed out, weaponizing language, is starting from a very different understanding of what the purpose of language is. If epistemologically you are a skeptic, then you don't see language as a tool of cognition. Its purpose is not to grasp the way things are, and to come up with clear definitions and the whole rest of the apparatus. You don't believe that language maps onto reality at all. If you combine that then with a very adversarial understanding of human social relationships. It's not the case from their perspective that you and I are potential friends, potential romantic partners, or potential business partners, and so forth. You're not looking for the win-win as you and I are in our philosophical outlet. If instead your understanding of human nature and values is adversarial, human beings are at war with each other. At root, we are enemies. Then what you want to do then is see language as a tool that you are using as a weapon in your battle with other people. In that case, fuzziness of language and kind of subverting all of the definitional, all of the semantic rules, all of the logical rules, subverting the understandings of scientific theories and so forth, anything that serves to undercut your enemy's use of language is then going to be useful to you in your adversarial battle. So one way to think about this is to go back to some of the earlier examples. So, if you take the issue of race and racism, the extent to which race is or is not a legitimate concept, that's an important issue for us to think about. And so, the psychology and the cultural issues and the biological issues, we should all pay attention to those and let the science work it out. To the extent that racism is an immoral way of evaluating other individuals, then having very clear standards of morality, of justice, of being able to judge individuals in terms of their character and their accomplishments and so forth, all of that morality becomes very, very important. But what we then find is that from the postmodern perspective, to the extent that postmodernists are using racism as an issue, the concept of racism, they do not want it to be defined clearly. And when they are accusing people of individuals or accusing individuals of being racist, from their perspective, this is not a truth or falsity issue. Rather, racism is a word that they have discovered that destabilizes other people. It gets inside their heads. It messes them up psychologically. It puts them on the defensive. And so the question is not, if I call you a racism, do I think that you really are a racist? It's not that at all. It's, I see you as my enemy for whatever reason, and I am using racism, that word, as a linguistic weapon to try to put you on the defensive so that in this rhetorical battle that we are engaged in, I can prevail over you, or my group can prevail over your group. So that's the weaponization of language.
Well, right. There is just so much more we wanted to talk about. We know we're at the end of our time here. I'm also going to link to your YouTube page, the Center for Ethics and Entrepreneurship, the YouTube channel. There's some great videos, excerpts from explaining postmodernism. I mean, even videos that you were doing, 7 to 10 years ago, when you're calling cultural trends 10 to 15 years early, it's still very relevant today. Right. So I just want to say,
I appreciate your sensitivity to our time here, and I enjoyed this conversation. And I agree we have lots more to talk about. So why don't we just plan on doing another one at some point in the future?
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Good. Well, thank you for joining us today. This has been the Ayn Rand Fan Club, and we will see you next time.